Now we're going to talk about um, some of the impacts of this time period of these revolutions going on the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade, the emancipation of Spanish America, and the issuance of the Monroe Doctrine by the USA. So, how did the Atlantic slave trade begin, and how did it end? So, it goes way back, over 500 years ago in the Americas. So, the Spanish discovered the Americas for Europe in 1492, Columbus, right? Within just 10 years, by 1501, um, African slaves were imported to Spain's colonies in the Americas. Now, they were not even the first slaves in the Americas. At first, very quickly, Spanish colonizers began enslaving Native Americans, the Amerindians, to work on plantations, to uh, on these what you might call cash crops, to get as much wealth, to extract as much wealth from their colonies as possible. These plantations also serve to kind of bring Spanish culture to the Native Americans, and what we now think of as a genocide, right? Um, so not only the culture, but the people are being killed at alarmingly high rates, right? The main culprit here is disease. These European diseases were extremely fatal to Native American populations. If you look at Mexico as a prime example, you go from estimated numbers of 25 million Native Americans in 1518 down to less than around 2 million. That's more than a 90% decrease, or more than 90% of the population lost. Right? Some islands, some areas lost every single Native American person that was native to that place. So extreme losses in those populations. But the Europeans, the colonizers, they still want to grow these crops and gain as much wealth as possible. So they look for other sources. The best source that they can find is Africa, which already had a slave trade that had been going on for hundreds of years. The Europeans really amp up that trade, though, right? They take advantage of it and make it much more severe, much more prolific than it was before. So they Europeans develop a system. They go to Africa. They bring goods. They sell to Africa. They mainly things like guns. They sell those guns, and in return they purchase enslaved Africans. They bring them to the Americas, where they work on these plantations, like sugar plantations, right? What this really extremely difficult crop to grow. It takes a lot of labor. It's a brutal process. So they grow things like sugar, and then they bring that sugar back to Europe and manufacture things, and then that's how you get that triangle of trade. From Europe, Africa, America, back to Europe. You can see the millions of enslaved Africans that were brought to the Americas, totaling at least 10 million plus, right? And you can see most of those enslaved Africans were going to Brazil, parts of South America, and the Caribbean. Relatively fewer, right, went to North America, although it's still in the hundreds of thousands. And that's a big part because of that sugar. So that's just one of the biggest things. Brazil and Caribbean had lots and lots of sugar plantations. But you get more and more cash crops like tobacco and cotton emerging in the American South, which also requires large amounts of labor. Here you can see this ship, the Vigilant, which was a ship used by slave merchants to bring human cargo from Africa to the Americas. It's a slave trader ship. Now, one thing I like to discuss in class is how look at how these human beings are packed into these ships, right? You think Europeans would allow other Europeans to be loaded in a ship like that, maybe on the journey from Spain to the Americas? Almost certainly not, right? The Europeans are packing in human beings like this because these slave traders in particular think of them as less than human, right? This is where we get the idea of what you call chattel slavery. Literally comes from the word cattle, because that's how these slave traders and those who bought these enslaved Africans viewed them, as little more than a commodity or an animal to be bought and sold. It's a horrible thing. And it's always good to mention that not everyone just sat there and took this, right? Most people felt too terrified or had already been beaten. Some even then decided to resist, right? There would be mutinies. There's famous examples of enslaved Africans taking over ships, right? Or there's a famous monument, I think it's in Massachusetts, says it's a monument to those who chose the sea, right? And there were some who'd rather die than be put in these ships and enslaved. So that's how it began. In America, it started 400 years ago in 1619, right? And here is when the slave trade technically ends, the Atlantic slave trade, right, technically ends. 1807, the UK bans it. 1808, the United States bans the importation of slaves, right? There's these liberal ideas spreading about freedom, democracy, and human rights, and it becomes harder and harder to accept the slave trade, right? And you get multiple northern states in the United States who ban slavery, and there's a big debate over it. So the slave importation is banned in 1808, and you'll notice though, slavery continues right up until 1865. So you can no longer import enslaved people, but you can sell those children of those already enslaved. And that's how the trade continues. So the British Empire abolishes slavery in its colonies in 1834. Right? No war fought, just a law passed. Now, they have slavery in everything but name continues, but they're technically not slaves. That becomes illegal. The USA abolished it in 1865. We'll come back to that one. And Brazil is the last one in the Americas, took all the way till 1888. Now, Brazil and the American South have something very much in common. They very much relied on slavery economically. It was extremely important to their economies. And that's very likely a reason why it took so long, and why in the United States it couldn't just be laws, or it wasn't just laws, it was war, right? The American Civil War. The most deadly war in American history, right? Mainly because there's both sides are Americans, but yeah, it remains the deadliest war in U.S. history. And what was it over? In the past, people tried to justify it, saying, it wasn't really over slavery. The American South was really concerned about things like states' rights, but modern historians kind of just accept that it was indeed about slavery. Here's a prime example to show you from Mississippi. So here are the Articles of Secession. Right, this is the document where Mississippi says, this is why we are leaving the United States and joining the Confederate States of America. Here is our reasoning. First paragraph, Right here, look at the very next paragraph. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. So they're saying, why are we leaving? Mainly because of slavery, right? Because we need, in Mississippi, they said, that they needed slaves. Otherwise, their economy would fail, basically, is what they're saying. And they try to have this kind of pseudo-scientific justification, right? Products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. Look at this. They're trying to say we have observed this law of nature. The black race is the only one that can bear exposure to the sun, right? This fake science they have created to justify it. And one of my favorite, we don't talk a whole lot about the Civil War, but one of my favorite examples of black resistance is this guy, Robert Smalls, who is enslaved in the American South and working for the Confederate States of America. He's being forced to, but he's given quite a bit of trust. And he works on these boats, these ships. So he is kind of told or ordered by the Confederate soldiers to kind of lock up the ship and go to bed. But instead he has access to the ship, so he rounds up several other enslaved families. They get on the ship. He gets his own family. They get on the ship, bring as many other belongings as they can very quickly. They get on the ship and they begin to escape the South. So and as he goes, he takes this Confederate code book, which has the codes to successfully get out, to successfully navigate out of the Confederate territory, because he's going to meet these Confederate ships as he goes, and they're going to want to see signals to know that he's friendly, right? So he starts to leave, gets on the ship. It's nighttime, right? And he comes to encounter these Confederate ships, but he has this book with him, so he knows the secrets. He gives them the right honks, the honk honk, the secret code to know that he's friendly, and they just wave him on through, right? Like go fight those Union soldiers. Right, little do they know who's piloting the ship, right? And he gets out of the Confederate territory and makes it to the Union. He can see the Union line, the Union ships, but then it occurs to him, they probably think I'm a Confederate ship, a hostile ship. So he quickly remembers that his wife, brought their bedding. He has a white bed sheet, so he strings it up on the pole, and now they're flying the white flag of surrender. And he surrenders the ship to the Union, and he is congratulated by President Abraham Lincoln and rewarded a large sum of money. And then he begins to work for the Union, helping the cause of the United States of America during the Civil War. One of my favorite stories, and that ship becomes part of the Union fleet. So we've already mentioned the latest date for the end of slavery in the Americas was in Brazil, right? Partially because they so heavily relied on that slavery. But if you can look at this map, the latest date on this map is 1981, right? Slavery was legal in several places into the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. Right? Did it occur in small numbers, perhaps, but it was still technically on the books as legal. Now, I've heard, and from what I can tell, it seems to be true, that there are, in fact, more enslaved people living today than at any point in human history. Right? So you can do some research on that yourself, but it's quite a startling statistic. So how did Spain's colonies gain independence? So by So first we're going to look at Haiti, right? Not actually a Spanish colony, but it's part of Latin America, but it is a French colony, and they are at the time, right? It's about 90% enslaved African Haitians, 10% white French Haitians, right? So, and it becomes this island of kind of punishment for runaway or rebellious slaves. And if a plantation has some enslaved Africans they want to get rid of, they will send them to Haiti. And then so Haiti kind of becomes this island of rebellious and runaway slaves. And there's multiple attempts at rebellion throughout its history. But at this point, France becomes distracted by the French Revolution and all that's going on there. And in 1791, this revolution starts. The burning of the Plain du Cap, massacre of whites by the blacks is what this is called, but that's basically what happened. They set fire to plantations, torch cities, and massacre the white population. And there's Toussaint Louverture, right, leader of the independent Haiti. He becomes the first leader when it's a republic, and he quickly becomes an emperor under Jean-Jacques Dessalines, right? So these are two important leaders to the Haitian Revolution. So Haiti becomes the second republic in the Americas after the USA, the first independent Latin American country, and the only country in history ever established by a successful slave revolt. So very unique situation in Haiti. What about Spain's colonies? So by 1800, most of South America was controlled by Spain and Portugal, right? Portugal owns Brazil, and Spain owns most of the rest of it. And they're, extracting resources, exploiting the population. They have this harsh class system where the closer to Europe you are, the more privilege you have. So people are born in Spain. The Peninsulares have the most privilege. The Creoles are those who have two European ancestry parents. Mestizos have people of Native American and European ancestry. The mulattoes have African and European ancestry. And those with the least privilege are Native Americans, Africans, and enslaved people. So this system is going on in Spain, right? And people are being exploited by Spain and Brazil and Portugal, rather. Spain and Portugal are just trying to extract as much wealth and as much resources out of the colonies as possible. And then people like Simón Bolívar, right? They are in that Creole group. They see themselves as just the same, pretty much, as the Peninsulares, but they don't have the same amount of privilege, right? And that also fuels that revolutionary spirit, right? So Simón Bolívar kind of leads revolutions in the north part of South America, and José de San Martin leads in the southern part. There's a lot of other leaders, but these are two of the main ones, right? And they are eventually successful after wars and different rebellions, movements. They successfully take control of almost all of South America. Right. Bolivar has a vision of a grand united South America, which never really comes into play. They do successfully have this country called Gran Colombia for a short time. He's president of Venezuela twice, Bolivia, and Peru. Some of these at the same time. So he's been president of more countries than anybody I've ever heard of. And here we have the northern part of South America after these revolutions. So you look at Latin America 1800 versus 1830. You'll notice 1800, most of this area is still owned by Europeans. By 1830, most of them are independent. We go to Mexico. Mexico having its own revolution, a little different than the ones in South America, right? But then, resisting Spanish rule. They kind of like France. They go through multiple governments somewhat quickly. They have a short-lived empire and then a republic. Hidalgo is one of the famous. He leads the mestizos, these lower class group. He's a Spanish. He's a Catholic priest, and he leads the kind of the impoverished of Mexico under the image of Ale de Guadalupe. And then Brazil is kind of unique in that while all the others in South America, Mexico, they mostly become independent through war. Brazil is a little different. The king and queen of Portugal flee to Brazil, while Napoleon is ransacking Europe. And while they are there, they hang out, but then they leave their son behind to kind of control Brazil. After Napoleon's gone, they go back to Europe and they leave their son Pedro behind. And he just kind of decides, I'm going to have my own country here, and he declares himself Emperor of Brazil. So really not a lot of violence in that one. So that was kind of unique. So how did they gain independence? Mostly by fighting, a lot of them led by those Creoles. But Brazil is unique in that it was relatively peaceful. And then Haiti is very unique because it was led by those enslaved Haitians, right, who rebel and become independent. Now finally to the Monroe Doctrine. So all these Europeans are losing their colonies in the Americas. All these colonies are becoming independent. President James Monroe sets out this policy that the United States will stop any more Europeans from coming in and making any more colonies in the Americas. It's like we are now free from Europeans. We don't need any more Europeans in the Americas, so stay out. Here we have cartoon literally drawing a line in the sand, right? These are the Europeans he's telling to keep out. Or here we have holding this bat showing that America will, Uncle Sam here represents America, showing that America will use force to keep Europeans out. And that's the Monroe Doctrine.